pulse began without warning. It wasn't the slow shimmer of reflected sunlight or the chaotic flicker of icy jets venting gas into the void, it was precise. Every 19 seconds, the coma of 3I, Atlas brightened, dimmed, then brightened again. To the telescopes tracking it from Earth's night side, the pattern was unmistakable, a rhythm, not a random flare. On spectral plots, it looked like the heartbeat of something mechanical or alive. At first, observers thought the data feed was corrupted. Glitches happen all the time. Cosmic rays hit detectors, digital arrays misfire. But then another observatory, half a world away, recorded the exact same sequence, down to the millisecond. The pattern persisted for hours, then stopped abruptly, as if aware it was being watched. Scientists paused their live streams, recalibrated, and waited. 4 hours later, the pulse returned, perfectly aligned to the previous phase. No known comet had ever behaved like this. Within hours, private astronomers began uploading footage to online forums, their graphs overlaid with eerie oscillations. Someone noticed the interval 19 seconds matched no known natural resonance in cometary material. That number, repeated over and over, became the focal point of sleepless nights in observatories from Hawaii to Chile. 19 seconds. A signal, a coincidence, or a phenomenon that had no precedent in celestial physics. By dawn, the data reached the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. Internal logs show analysts flagging the light modulation as non-instrumental, in other words, not a glitch. The object itself was producing the variation. A day later, NASA's Deep Space Network quietly joined the observation effort. Radio dishes in Madrid, Goldstone, and Canberra tuned to the comet's coordinates. They found no radio emission, just silence. Yet in the optical spectrum, the pulsing continued, steady and unbroken. For the public, the event began as rumour, strange lights in data streams, whispers of alien patterns. But to the scientists who'd been following 3I, Atlas, since its discovery, it was something far stranger. The comet wasn't just glowing, it was responding. When instruments switched from visible to infrared, the pulse amplitude shifted, as if compensating. As one astrophysicist described in a private message later leaked online, "It's like it knows it's being observed." Hours turned into days. The rhythm grew fainter, then suddenly intensified. In some wavelengths it even split 2 pulses close together, then a gap, then one again. Across multiple observatories the same modulation appeared. The synchronization was impossible to dismiss. If this were outgassing, the pressure would create chaotic jets, not timed bursts of light. If it were reflective rotation, the interval should change as the comet tumbled through space. But it didn't. The timing held 19 seconds, unwavering. Speculation exploded. Some claimed it was a magnetic resonance effect, a byproduct of charged particles interacting with the solar wind. Others wondered if the comet's nucleus contained materials unknown to Earth science, superconducting compounds perhaps, responding to solar flux in a way never documented before. Still, the tone in official communications grew cautious. NASA's brief statement described the anomaly as a periodic photometric variation under study, a phrase that said everything and nothing. Meanwhile, a quieter narrative formed among the few who noticed something deeper. The light curve wasn't purely sinusoidal, it contained subharmonics, tiny deviations that formed what appeared to be structure. One analysis suggested that if converted to sound, the pulse produced a repeating tone near 52 Hz, the same frequency once associated with the loneliest whale ever recorded. Coincidence, surely. Yet the symbolism was haunting, a single wandering body sending rhythmic cries across an indifferent cosmos. Astronomers adjusted their algorithms. They found that when multiple telescopes observed simultaneously, the pulse weakened slightly, but when left unmonitored for a span of hours, it returned stronger. A feedback loop, or something more enigmatic? Theories multiplied, but evidence remained elusive. Even the Hubble's successor, the Lynx Observatory, couldn't resolve the nucleus. Clearly it shimmered with heat distortions inconsistent with a frozen body. Some images showed faint geometric contours under the coma, but data compression made it impossible to verify. By the end of the first week, the global astronomy network was in quiet turmoil. Internal chats revealed unease. What if the modulation wasn't natural? And what if it wasn't accidental? The phrase controlled luminosity appeared in a European Space Agency memo later deleted from public servers, but before anyone could demand explanations, the pulse changed again. It slowed. 21 seconds now, then 23. a drifting tempo as though the comet were adjusting, experimenting. In the second week, amateur trackers noticed something more unsettling. The light pattern was no longer symmetric. The bright phase lasted slightly longer than the dim one, an asymmetry that implied directional emission, like a rotating beacon sweeping through space. When triangulated, the brightest phase pointed not randomly, but consistently toward Earth's orbital plane. It wasn't broadcasting omnidirectionally, it was aligning. The possibility that this was coincidence still lingered, but when a team at Caltech cross-referenced data from 3 independent telescopes, they found micro-delays between the pulses, a staggered sequence, as if the light was being emitted in waves traveling across the nucleus, not from a single point. Something was moving across its surface, triggering the emissions sequentially. That meant internal organization, movement. One researcher privately noted the energy output. Each flash equaled roughly the brightness of a small asteroid impact plume, sustained over fractions of a second. No natural jet could pulse like that without disintegrating the body. Yet 3I, Atlas, remained intact. Its coma expanded and contracted in perfect time, a living breath of light and shadow. Then came the first coordinated alert. Astronomers in Chile reported faint oscillations in the comet's trajectory, deviating by a few meters per second minute, but statistically impossible under gravitational prediction. A non-gravitational force was acting on it. If solar pressure couldn't account for it, what could? Some whispered propulsion. Others invoked electrostatic effects or quantum reflection from unknown materials. But deep down, most knew no comet had ever done this before. The event marked a turning point. The world's instruments built to decode the language of stars were now listening to something that might be speaking back. Whether it was physics, coincidence, or communication, no one could yet decide. But for the first time, a comet wasn't just a relic from another system. It was an active participant in its own mystery. And as the pulses grew weaker, almost as if retreating into silence, a new fear emerged among those watching closely. If the rhythm stopped completely, would that mean it was over, or that it had finished listening? At 3:12 UTC, the pulse changed again. The brightness modulated faster, the pattern tightening until the interval fell to precisely 17.4 seconds. It was a small difference, but across the global network of observatories, alarms triggered automatically. The comet's light wasn't fading, it was encoding. A waveform buried in the brightness curve now displayed a second-order oscillation, faint but consistent, like a carrier signal hidden within noise. Scientists at the European Southern Observatory were the first to notice the sub-pattern. Using Fourier transforms on the raw optical data, they isolated an amplitude variation that cycled every 7 pulses, a layered structure that implied order, not randomness. If this were purely thermal outgassing, the intervals should blur under stochastic venting. Instead, they remained crystalline, mechanical, a pattern within a pattern. By dawn, the term optical modulation event began circulating through private channels. NASA issued an internal directive halting public release of new photometric data, pending verification. The timing was telling. Verification in bureaucratic code meant uncertainty too great for public interpretation. Within hours, independent observatories reported locked access to the official JPL orbital tracker. The comet's coordinates froze at, last updated, 2:59 UTC. Still, the data found ways to leak. Amateur networks like Las Cumbres and the Virtual Telescope project had already cached their frames. On social media, stitched-together brightness plots spread like wildfire. The pulse wasn't just changing frequency, it was drifting in wavelength, slightly redder each cycle, as though the source of emission was cooling or receding, yet the energy output remained stable. Inside the deep space network, engineers recalculated signal thresholds. The optical pulses were invisible to radio instruments, but something else appeared at the edge of their detection band, ultra-low frequency magnetic ripples, precisely matching the pulse cadence. Not sound, not light, but oscillations in the near-field magnetic domain impossible for a simple chunk of ice and dust. If verified, this meant 3I, Atlas was emitting coherent energy, synchronized across multiple frequencies. It was here the argument began, light or signal. Was the brightness modulation simply a photometric trick, or was it data encoded in the universal language of periodicity? The world's agencies split into factions. One camp insisted on natural explanation, an exotic resonance caused by interstellar isotopes reacting with solar radiation. The other camp, quieter but persistent, argued the intervals bore hallmarks of intentional design. The tension reached the public indirectly. When a data enthusiast posted a cleaned signal graph online, the video vanished within hours, flagged for security reasons. That phrase appeared often in the following days, applied to amateur astronomy pages, live streams, and archived telescope feeds. For the first time since its discovery, 3I, Atlas was not just a scientific object, it was classified information. The astrophysics community, accustomed to open data, reacted with disbelief. "You can't hide a comet," one professor tweeted before her account was suspended. And yet, visibility wasn't the issue. Transparency was. The official feeds went silent, and only fragments of private observatory data trickled out. Through them, a picture began to form, a chillingly deliberate one. When plotted as a time-lapse, the comet's light pulses aligned in a helix pattern, not in space, but in time, a spiraling rhythm that seemed to evolve. The pulse spacing shortened, then elongated, but always returned to a mean interval. Some described it as a breathing curve, others a heartbeat. One physicist at Kyoto University noted the ratio between long and short pulses formed an irrational fraction identical to the golden ratio, phi. Coincidence, again? Or a message encoded in nature's own mathematics? Even the skeptics grew uneasy. In cosmic physics, periodicity usually signals stability, rotation, orbit, or resonance. But 3I, Atlas, was displaying dynamic modulation, something alive to feedback, almost aware. When the optical modulation correlated with subtle course deviations, measurable changes in its trajectory, the term reactive drift entered the lexicon. It was drifting, not randomly, but in response to observation. Some claimed this was proof of sensor bias, that human tracking itself introduced the illusion of behavior. But when automated AI observatories replicated the same readings, the bias argument collapsed. The comet truly was altering its own visible pattern. No known mechanism explained it. Then, late one night, a faint burst of radio static swept across the 1.6 GHz band, a whisper buried beneath galactic noise. Analysts at the SETI Institute detected it purely by chance while calibrating for pulsar studies. The signal matched 3I, Atlas's coordinates, to within half a degree. When converted to sound, it resembled a brief ascending tone, just 3 notes, then silence. It was too brief, too faint to analyze, but it carried the same 17.4-second rhythm as the optical pulse. Officially, it was dismissed as interference. Unofficially, it spread like a contagion through encrypted academic circles. Was this the first interstellar transmission ever recorded, or the dying cry of a body tearing itself apart? Nobody could agree. Yet beneath the surface, something undeniable was happening. Data was being withheld, not to protect the public from confusion, but perhaps to protect institutions from admitting they didn't understand what they were seeing. For a moment, it seemed like the story might fade, just another cosmic anomaly explained away in time. But then came the press conference. The European Space Agency, flanked by astronomers from NASA and JAXA, appeared calm, scripted. They acknowledged optical variations inconsistent with thermal models, promised continued monitoring, and discouraged speculation. When a journalist asked if the light pulses might represent artificial origin, the lead spokesperson smiled tightly and said, "There is no evidence of intelligent modulation." The phrasing caught attention. Not proof of absence, just no evidence yet. It was the kind of linguistic precision agencies use when they know more than they can say. As the cameras faded, the comet pulsed again, stronger, sharper, visible even to backyard telescopes. For the first time, the naked eye could catch it. A faint twinkle, rhythmically rising and falling near the edge of the constellation Auriga. The world had never witnessed a comet behave this way. And somewhere in the data archives, hidden but later leaked, was one final note from an analyst at the Goldstone complex. The pulse stabilized exactly when observation was suspended. Correlation or communication? Scientists still can't explain why it brightens only when unseen. But if the act of watching changes its behavior, then the question becomes terrifyingly simple. What happens when it starts watching back? The first sign of physical movement came from a telescope that wasn't supposed to be watching it. On October 19, a survey instrument at the Atacama Array, tasked with cataloguing exoplanet microlensing, caught 3I, Atlas, shifting its position by 0.003 degrees between frames. That deviation might sound microscopic, but at the comet's distance, it translated to a displacement of nearly 1,000 kilometers. The motion was subtle, fluid, not ballistic. Something inside it had changed. By dawn, orbital modelers at JPL confirmed the unthinkable. The comet's path had diverged from the predicted arc. Its velocity vector showed a faint lateral component, unaccounted for by solar radiation pressure or gas jet outflows. Even after adjusting for photometric bias, the error persisted. The object wasn't coasting passively through the solar system anymore, it was steering. At first, the models bent under skepticism. Analysts ran recalculations through every known perturbation, variable solar wind, gravitational resonance, Yarkovsky effects, but nothing fit. The deviation wasn't random. It followed a curve that seemed to anticipate gravitational wells before entering them. In other words, it wasn't reacting to forces, it was preparing for them. Inside the agencies, debate turned to chaos. Some claimed the data was contaminated by magnetic interference from solar flares. Others suspected a software error in the astrometric pipeline. But after independent teams at the European Southern Observatory and the Indian Space Research Centre both reported the same trajectory shift, doubt gave way to alarm. It was official. 3I, Atlas, was no longer where it should be. They called the phenomenon non-gravitational drift. Historically, comets do experience small course corrections due to uneven outgassing, but those are irregular, chaotic, and thermally driven. This was different. The drift was consistent, occurring in smooth periodic vectors that aligned eerily with the same interval as its light pulses. The comet was effectively correcting its own motion. For the first time, the possibility of internal propulsion was raised, not by journalists or conspiracy theorists, but by scientists within the system. One memo, later leaked from ESA's internal cloud, stated bluntly, "We cannot rule out energy generation within the body." The phrase set off a storm. If the nucleus contained a reactor-like mechanism, or worse, an artificial core, then humanity was witnessing the first controlled object ever known to cross between stars. Publicly, nothing was said. Official channels repeated the same sanitized phrasing, "Further study required." But behind the scenes, telescopes once trained on exoplanets, dark matter, even Mars were redirected. A global observation grid took shape overnight, all focused on one dim speck drifting between constellations. Meanwhile, data streams began to vanish again. Independent astronomers noticed missing timestamps in raw telemetry gaps that lasted hours, then entire nights. When pressed, agencies cited telemetry synchronization delays. The phrase became a euphemism for silence. Yet, amid that silence, new anomalies surfaced. Infrared readings from the Subaru telescope showed that the comet's surface temperature had spiked by nearly 30 Kelvin, far too much for solar heating alone. If it were venting gases, the temperature should have dropped due to cooling expansion. Instead, it climbed. The implication was haunting. Energy was being released from within. A month earlier, 3I, Atlas, had been a faint interstellar traveller. Now it was behaving like a vessel under quiet power. Theorists split into camps again. Some invoked electrostatic propulsion, a natural capacitor effect caused by magnetic buildup across metallic minerals. Others whispered of biological mechanisms, self-regulating chemistry that mimicked sentience. But a growing faction proposed a third explanation, that the comet was neither natural nor alive, but an ancient construct, a remnant of some lost civilization using a shell of ice as camouflage. It sounded absurd, yet deep down, no one could dismiss it entirely. The data, cold, mathematical, didn't care about human disbelief. It only pointed to a single truth. Something inside the comet was active. The shift in trajectory wasn't random either. Its new vector would bring it closer to the ecliptic plane, closer to Earth. The adjustment wasn't large, but deliberate enough to change its solar flyby angle. It would now pass nearer to Venus's orbit, inside the zone where solar observation becomes difficult due to glare. In other words, it was steering toward invisibility. That was when the phrase blind transit first appeared in reports. A body-altering course to pass through the sun's glare precisely where observation is impossible for days at a time. Whether this was coincidence or intent, no one dared to say, but in private circles a darker theory emerged. The comet wasn't avoiding light, it was avoiding being seen. A few astronomers tried to push back, They argued for simple physics, a combination of ice crystallization, uneven sublimation, or magnetic coupling. No need for aliens when you have chemistry, one physicist wrote, but as data continued to vanish, even skeptics grew uneasy. The institutions they trusted seemed less interested in understanding the anomaly than in controlling its narrative. Leaked transcripts from a closed ESA-NASA meeting revealed the level of unease. One voice unidentified was heard saying, "If it's reacting to observation, stop observing." Another replied, "And if observation is what's keeping it calm?" The line ended there, followed by the sound of chairs scraping and papers shifting. No one ever confirmed what decision they reached. That night, a new kind of silence descended on the feeds. The comet's location updates froze. When the blackout lifted hours later, the brightness curve had changed completely. The pulse interval was gone. Instead, a continuous glow filled the data stream's static brightness, unbroken, almost like a signal on standby. Some described it as dormancy, others called it hibernation, but a handful of independent trackers noticed something more alarming. When triangulated across time, the last few data points formed a spiral curve, an inward corkscrew suggesting precession. If accurate, the comet wasn't simply moving, it was orienting itself. Scientists still can't explain how a loosely bound mass of ice and dust could alter orientation with such precision, yet the math is undeniable. The torque required exceeds any known natural mechanism. And still, the light holds steady, as if waiting. In the end, humanity was left watching a silent enigma, drifting toward a region where observation would soon be impossible. The instruments kept recording, but the comet no longer pulsed. The rhythm was gone. Or perhaps it had shifted to a frequency we could no longer perceive. Somewhere in the data logs a single note appeared, unsigned, written by an exhausted analyst. "If motion is message, we may already be in the conversation." But no one replied, because by then, 3I, Atlas had already begun to vanish into the light of the sun, its final move before the world would lose sight of it completely. When the blackout began, it felt deliberate. Not a technical glitch, not a bandwidth issue, just sudden total silence. For exactly 72 hours, every public-facing database tracking 3I, Atlas, went dark. The orbital visualizations, the brightness curves, even the real-time amateur streams all frozen, as if the comet itself had been erased. Only the timestamp "data unavailable under calibration" remained. Inside the astronomy community, panic whispered through encrypted channels. Observatories weren't receiving their usual coordinate updates from NASA's JPL Horizon system. Independent trackers tried to reconstruct the comet's position manually, but without official telemetry, even the best predictions diverged by hundreds of kilometers. It was as if the agencies had quietly decided that seeing too much had become a problem. When the blackout ended, the data returned altered. The new coordinates showed 3I, Atlas, ahead of its previous orbit, having accelerated slightly during the gap. The error margin exceeded every acceptable threshold. Under Newtonian mechanics, such a velocity change would require an external force equivalent to a controlled burn from a small spacecraft. But comets don't have engines. They sublimate, they tumble, they decay, they don't accelerate. The official explanation arrived swiftly: solar wind vector miscalculation. Yet the recorded solar flux during the blackout was moderate and uniform. No coronal mass ejections, no anomalous activity. The data didn't add up. What did add up too perfectly was the pattern of information withholding. Each time the comet did something unexplainable, observation halted, data was corrected, and the anomaly reappeared, now sanitized. A group of independent astronomers, working from Chile, South Africa, and northern Finland, refused to accept the new coordinates. They built a distributed observation network, a mesh of telescopes and synchronized clocks designed to bypass centralized feeds. The system, dubbed Open Sky, captured its own light data in real time, immune to institutional edits. What they saw unsettled them. During the blackout period, 3I, Atlas, had flared massively, a pulse lasting nearly 9 minutes, bright enough to register against background solar scatter even with the sun nearby. The flare's energy signature didn't match any known spectral emission. It was cold light, rich in low-frequency wavelengths that implied coherent photon emission, something more akin to a laser than reflected sunlight. The temperature models failed to reconcile how ice could produce such output without total disintegration. And yet, when the flare subsided, the comet was intact, Its coma had restructured symmetrical, spherical, too perfect to be random. Amateur astronomers described it as a halo, a luminous envelope radiating uniform intensity. That shape alone defied natural sublimation, which always produces uneven tails. It looked engineered. Open Sky scientists submitted their findings to peer-reviewed journals, but the submissions vanished before publication. 2 weeks later, the journals issued polite statements. We have chosen not to proceed with review due to unverifiable data sources. The tone was clinical, but the message clear: someone had intervened. Behind the scenes, agency insiders began leaking fragments of what they'd seen. One document, later authenticated by metadata, contained a phrase that became legend: reactive event non-thermal acceleration, likely internal. No context, no equations, just that. It was enough to ignite a firestorm. If internal meant what it sounded like, the comet wasn't being pushed by sunlight or jets, it was generating motion from within. That's when the first whispers of containment appeared. According to sources cited in private correspondences, there was genuine fear that the object might represent something beyond control. Some argued it could destabilize public trust if its nature were revealed prematurely. Others believed the secrecy was meant to buy time to understand before acknowledging. Whatever the motive, the pattern was unmistakable. Silence after shock, edits after anomaly. Meanwhile, independent sensors kept running. Amateur spectroscopists detected faint emissions near the 21-centimeter hydrogen line, barely measurable, but distinct. The line itself wasn't strange. Hydrogen saturates the universe. What was strange was its rhythm, modulated in phase with the comet's light fluctuations, like an echo across frequencies. The same signal, translated through matter and light. A few theorists proposed a breathtaking idea. The comet was resonating with the solar field, harnessing electromagnetic pressure as a means of movement. That would explain the coherent flare, the acceleration, and the rhythmic shifts. It would mean the object was acting like a solar sail but without a sail. A self-contained resonance engine, ancient or alien in origin, camouflaged as a cometary shell. Others refused to go that far. They called it coincidence, cosmic pareidolia, the human tendency to find pattern where none exists. But their protests grew quieter when a new development shattered even cautious skepticism. During the blackout, the comet had changed spin orientation. High-resolution photometry from Open Sky revealed that its rotational axis had shifted by nearly 12 degrees, a feat impossible without torque. Whatever had moved it had done so with precision. One astrophysicist compared the motion to a satellite performing an attitude correction burn. The energy calculations supported it. The drift matched what would be expected from a single impulse lasting several minutes, the same duration as the mysterious flare. When asked to comment, an ESA official simply said, "Our instruments observed nothing unusual." The denial came 2 hours before new data confirmed the shift was real. The silence following that announcement spoke louder than any admission could. The comet, once a cold rock from another system, now seemed to possess agency. It accelerated, changed spin, adjusted orientation, and maintained structural integrity despite emitting immense energy. Every one of those behaviors contradicted centuries of cometary physics. The old question, "What is it?" was no longer enough. The new one was worse. What does it want? As speculation spiraled, another fear took hold. What if this wasn't the first time? What if other interstellar objects had done the same before humanity had instruments capable of noticing? The archives from early telescopic history are full of comets that brightened unexpectedly or altered course before fading into obscurity. Maybe we just hadn't been watching closely enough. That idea chilled even the skeptics, because if 3I, Atlas, was following a pattern older than civilization, then humanity wasn't witnessing a first encounter, it was witnessing a recurrence. Scientists still can't explain why the blackout coincided perfectly with the comet's acceleration, or why the spectral halo formed afterward. But as it continued to glide toward the Sun, its path now arcing closer to Earth's orbit, one conclusion felt unavoidable. The silence wasn't just bureaucratic. It might have been a reaction to something humanity wasn't ready to hear. And as the comet disappeared into solar interference, the data logs ended with a haunting note from a frustrated astronomer. They're calling it calibration again. But if you look closely, it's not us who are recalibrating, it's the sky. The blackout ended in silence, but the world didn't go back to normal. The night skies were restless, filled with whispers that could not be measured by instruments alone. In the weeks that followed, the comet's path continued to defy mathematics, tracing an arc that bent slightly inward, closer to the sun than anyone predicted, yet never straying into instability. It was balancing itself, correcting, moving with intent. NASA's official trackers quietly reclassified 3I, Atlas, as dynamic object, active cometary process. The phrase was new. It didn't appear in any previous database. To those who understood bureaucratic language, that subtle phrasing meant one thing: we don't know what it is. The standard cometary categories volatile, dormant, fragmented, no longer applied. 3I, Atlas, was behaving like none of them. Around the same time, reports surfaced of faint electromagnetic disturbances at radio observatories across 3 continents. Instruments tuned to background cosmic noise began registering brief null points, seconds-long silences in ambient radio flux, synchronized to the comet's orbital position. These were not bursts or signals, but absences, moments where the usual hum of the universe simply stopped. No known physical process could explain such precise recurring voids. The data logs called them spectrum gaps, but inside the agencies they were given a different name: shadow bands. The term suggested intention, as if something were blocking or absorbing energy in timed intervals. Independent physicists theorized that 3I, Atlas, was interacting with the heliosphere, disturbing the magnetic boundary between solar and interstellar space. The idea was plausible until someone noticed the timing. The gaps appeared only when direct observation paused. Every time a major telescope was offline, the silence in the spectrum deepened. It was as though the comet knew when it wasn't being watched and used those moments to act. That concept awareness wasn't taken lightly. In classified internal discussions, later leaked to the press, an ESA committee debated whether to treat the object as a potential autonomous system. The idea was buried in technical jargon: behavioral independence, non-random temporal correlation, adaptive modulation, but the implication was unmistakable. If confirmed, it would mean that 3I, Atlas, was not just reacting to physical forces but making decisions. Still, the institutions remained quiet. They could not confirm the impossible, and they could not deny what everyone could see. Instead, they shifted focus. The public-facing research pivoted toward data normalization studies, effectively replacing real-time tracking with theoretical modeling. In the absence of truth, simulation became the shield. But outside official circles, the search continued. The Open Sky network, still operating under peer-to-peer coordination, began combining optical and radio data into hybrid models. One night, a graduate student analyzing the integrated spectrum noticed a peculiar harmonic spike repeating across all frequencies, a faint, low-frequency hum buried deep in the noise. When isolated and amplified, it formed a mathematical structure eerily reminiscent of a Fibonacci sequence. At first, the team dismissed it as coincidence, a product of overlapping harmonics. But when they compared the pattern across multiple observation dates, they found the ratio remained constant even as the comet's light intensity changed. The sequence was stable, self-similar, recursive. Not random, not chaotic, but encoded in the very act of emission. When plotted visually, the data resembled a spiral, and when rotated in time, that spiral unfolded into something strikingly geometric, almost architectural. The analysis was still ongoing when the servers hosting OpenSky were suddenly taken offline. The logs were deleted, the backups corrupted, the entire network dismantled under what was described as a cyber intrusion of unknown origin. Days later, several of the same researchers received legal notices warning them not to publish their findings under international data privacy statutes. That phrase, vague and unprecedented, he effectively froze them. The spiral remained unseen, known only through whispers and screenshots passed between private channels. Meanwhile, the comet entered a new phase. The once pulsing light had stabilized into a dull, steady glow, but in radio wavelengths it began to hum. Long, low-frequency oscillations appeared across the electromagnetic spectrum, signals so faint they were initially dismissed as equipment interference, yet they persisted. Every 23 minutes, like clockwork, the hum returned. It was inaudible to human ears, but when converted into sound, it produced a resonant tone, deep, solemn, almost organic. Scientists argued endlessly about the mechanism. Was it a magnetic coupling effect, perhaps caused by the comet's charged dust interacting with solar particles? Or was it something internal, a resonance pulse radiating through its own structure? One researcher likened it to a whale's call across an ocean of plasma, a deliberate vibration meant to be felt more than heard. The mystery deepened when radar backscatter data revealed another impossible truth. Inside the comet's core, the echo pattern changed between scans. On one day, the radar reflection showed a dense, metallic core. 2 days later, it appeared porous, almost hollow. These fluctuations could not be explained by melting or fragmentation. They implied internal reconfiguration, as if the structure itself was shifting. At this point, even the most skeptical voices faltered. If this is still a comet, one astronomer wrote in an anonymous post, then we need a new definition of the word natural. Public discourse grew wild. Forums filled with theories, some fantastical, others eerily consistent. The most persistent claim was that the object was not a vessel, but a signal amplifier, a moving mirror reflecting transmissions between stars. That would explain the rhythmic magnetic shadows and harmonic pulses. It wasn't speaking, but relaying. No agency addressed the speculation, but the absence of denial spoke louder than words. The silence now felt less like ignorance and more like consent, an unspoken acknowledgement that the truth was simply too large to fit inside the bounds of public understanding. Then, without warning, 3I, Atlas, flared again, not visually, but electromagnetically. Instruments across the globe recorded a synchronized surge, an EM wave rippling through the upper ionosphere, brief yet measurable. It lasted 3 seconds. And then, as abruptly as it appeared, the hum stopped. Every instrument fell quiet. Every telescope reported normal conditions. The comet, once alive with rhythm and radiation, had gone utterly still. It was drifting again, passive, inert, silent. As if whatever force had animated it was now dormant, or perhaps listening. Scientists still can't explain how the spectrum gaps, Fibonacci harmonics, and structural shifts could coexist within a body that by all measures should be disintegrating. But the most haunting detail came later, buried deep in an unredacted portion of a private memo from the SETI research network. It contained a single cryptic sentence: "If the silence is the message, we may have already answered." And somewhere between the sun and the stars, 3I, Atlas kept moving quiet, steady, its secrets intact. The hum was gone, but not forgotten. Because silence, after all, is still a kind of sound. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It had weight, tension, a presence that filled every observatory with unease. After the electromagnetic flare, 3I, Atlas, stopped emitting anything measurable. No optical pulses, no radio harmonics, no magnetic shadows. It drifted through the heliosphere as though nothing had ever happened, an ordinary comet once more. But to those who had been watching since the beginning, the quiet felt wrong. At the Deep Space Network's Madrid facility, technicians began noticing strange gaps, not in the comet's signal, but in their own equipment logs. Entire minutes of missing time appeared in the telemetry archives, precisely aligned with the comet's position updates. The instruments weren't malfunctioning, they were simply not recording. As if some unseen synchronization was rewriting the system's perception of time itself. When engineers restored the missing sequences from analog backups, they found something unnerving. Buried within the static were faint, structured noise bursts, binary-like sequences repeating across intervals. It wasn't clear whether the pattern originated from 3I, Atlas, or the equipment, but the correlation was perfect. Each burst occurred exactly when the comet's theoretical position aligned with solar magnetic nodes, zones of high flux, where electromagnetic interference should have been chaotic, not ordered. Some suspected the comet was using the sun's own magnetic field as a carrier, embedding low-frequency modulations in plasma waves. If true, it meant 3I, Atlas wasn't broadcasting. It was piggybacking, hiding its transmissions within the fabric of solar noise itself. That possibility terrified mission control. It meant humanity's most watched star could be an unwitting relay for a message no one was meant to intercept. The data was pulled offline within hours. When reporters asked about the gaps, NASA's public statement was brief: no irregularities detected, data synchronization ongoing. But inside, the scientists knew better. The irregularities weren't gone, they were systemic, woven into the very tools used to measure reality. Amid this confusion, a quiet rebellion formed. A group of scientists from 5 countries calling themselves the Continuum Group began analyzing the raw magnetometer readings independently. Using decommissioned satellites and ground arrays, They triangulated faint fluctuations in the solar magnetic field. What they found was staggering. The interference wasn't random. It formed a repeating pattern around the sun's ecliptic plane, a massive, invisible ring of magnetized space, oscillating in perfect rhythm with 3I, Atlas's orbit. The comet wasn't drifting through the solar system, it was orchestrating it. Each time it crossed a magnetic node, the surrounding field shifted slightly, as if being tuned. The pattern repeated with mathematical precision, modulating frequencies across millions of kilometers. To the Continuum group, it looked like a scan, a systematic sweep of the inner solar environment, as though the comet were mapping resonance points or searching for something specific. The implications were enormous. If correct, it meant 3I, Atlas wasn't communicating outward, but inward, testing, probing, preparing. The group's final report concluded with a chilling line. This may not be a transmission, it may be calibration. Before the report could be published, one of the lead astronomers vanished from public life. Her colleagues claimed she had accepted a classified assignment. Her social media accounts were deleted, her research institution scrubbed her name from active projects. The others disbanded quietly, some citing burnout, others health concerns. The Continuum group ceased to exist, their findings locked away in encrypted archives. Still, fragments of their work leaked. In one recovered excerpt, a schematic of the solar field showed a spiral emanating from the comet's path, a vast, slow-turning gyre that reached far beyond the orbit of Mars. If projected backward, the spiral's origin aligned with the outer heliopause, the boundary where the sun's influence fades into interstellar space. It wasn't random geometry, it was a trajectory, a purpose. Then came the solar flare. On November 28, a sudden burst of plasma erupted from the sun's surface, classified as an X9 class event, the most powerful in over a decade. The flare knocked out satellites, disrupted radio bands, and painted auroras across equatorial skies, but amid the chaos, something extraordinary occurred. For 8 minutes, 3I, Atlas, reappeared. It glowed with a strange internal light, visible even through the storm. Observatories caught fragmented images, streaks of bluish-white illumination, pulsing through the coma, forming concentric rings like ripples in water. The rings expanded outward, fading into the solar wind. Then the light vanished, and the comet went dark again. When the solar storm subsided, new telemetry revealed that 3I, Atlas's velocity, had increased once more. Its speed now exceeded all models by a margin of 0.06%, tiny, but impossible without propulsion. Worse, its vector had shifted again ever so slightly inward, pulling closer toward the sun's magnetic equator. It was as if the flare had activated it. Scientists scrambled for explanations. Could charged particles have induced some electrochemical chain reaction in its surface materials? Could internal sublimation have been reignited by the solar shockwave? But those theories collapsed under the same question. Why did it happen in perfect synchronization with a naturally random solar event? A few dared to suggest the unthinkable, that the comet had anticipated the flare. Days before the eruption, the sun's magnetic field began twisting, a precursor known only to expert solar physicists. Somehow, 3I Atlas had altered its course just in time to align with the field's compression zone, the exact region that would release the flare. Coincidence could not account for the precision. It was as if the comet had known it was coming. That idea spread quietly through scientific circles. Some proposed it was merely resonance, that the comet's orbit happened to coincide with solar periodicity, but privately, a darker narrative took hold. If the comet was reacting in anticipation, it meant its sensors, or whatever mechanisms governed its behavior, operated beyond human understanding. It was reading solar behavior before it happened, predicting, waiting. A memo from the Royal Astronomical Society captured the unease in one line: if 3I, Atlas, is interacting with solar energy, then it's learning from it. The public remained oblivious. The news cycle was filled with stories about auroras, satellites, and atmospheric disruptions. Only in the footnotes of astrophysics journals did hints appear, brief mentions of anomalous reflectivity variance and unexpected orbital precession. The truth was hidden in plain sight, disguised as statistical uncertainty. But among those who had been following the comet from the beginning, a sense of dread began to settle. The pulse had returned, subtle, fragmented, riding on the magnetic breath of the sun itself. Only this time, it wasn't visible to telescopes. It was encoded in the fluctuations of solar wind density, a pulse written into the plasma of space. Scientists still can't explain how a comet could manipulate solar magnetic fields or predict stellar activity, yet the data leaves little room for denial. Something intelligent or at least self-regulating was unfolding before human eyes, and the deeper question was no longer what 3I, Atlas, was doing, but why it was doing it here. Because if it had crossed the gulf between stars to reach this system, then its recent alignment wasn't random, it was deliberate. And as one scientist dared to whisper, before her microphone was cut off during a conference broadcast, what if the sun wasn't just a destination? What if it was the reason it came? By December, the comet's behavior no longer resembled anything natural. Its orbit had stabilized, not chaotically, but purposefully locking into a resonance with the sun's magnetic equator. Every 26 hours, precise to the second, instruments registered a fluctuation in solar wind density that corresponded exactly with 3I, Atlas's position. It was a pattern so subtle that it took weeks of cross-reference data to confirm, but once verified, it was undeniable. The comet wasn't being pushed by the solar wind, it was shaping it. At the Harvard-Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics, a closed-door symposium convened under the title Anomalous Resonant Behavior of Non-Terrestrial Objects. Only senior astrophysicists, agency liaisons, and a handful of data analysts were allowed to attend. The notes from that meeting, later leaked, revealed how deep the uncertainty ran. One line stood out. "We are not observing a natural body anymore, we are witnessing an active system." The term active system was carefully chosen. It meant self-regulating, possibly autonomous, yet not explicitly intelligent. It allowed scientists to talk about impossible data without crossing into forbidden territory, but among themselves, in private emails and encrypted messages, they admitted what they feared most: intent. Meanwhile, the world outside that room remained blissfully unaware. The few journalists who had followed the story were met with silence or denial. Every major news outlet quietly buried their coverage. The only trace remained in amateur astronomy forums, where the last unfiltered observers shared faint spectral graphs and shaky telescope footage. Each post felt like a desperate act of defiance. Then, on December 12, a new anomaly shattered the stalemate. For 6 minutes, instruments across the globe detected a coordinated dip in background cosmic radiation. It wasn't localized, it occurred planet-wide, simultaneous across all detectors, from Antarctica to the ISS. The cause was never identified. But when overlaid with solar observation data, the dip coincided precisely with a single event: 3I, Atlas, crossing the sun's magnetic equator. Whatever it had been preparing for, it had just completed a phase transition. The next day, a burst of data hit the deep space network, a massive influx of telemetry packets that appeared to originate from the direction of the comet, though not transmitted by any known frequency. Analysts described it as a mathematical storm. The packets weren't random noise, they formed recursive patterns, equations nested within equations. Some of the data blocks even contained recognizable constants pi, e, phi woven into binary sequences. The implications were staggering. If the data truly originated from 3I, Atlas, it wasn't just interacting with solar energy, it was transmitting structured information through it. That would mean the object was both observing and communicating, using the sun as a medium. When the discovery leaked, agencies moved swiftly. The DSN logs were sealed. The SETI Institute released a formal statement calling the readings natural cosmic background fluctuations. Yet, privately, SETI's analysts were divided. One memo contained a note in red ink: "Pattern repeats every 87 minutes. This is not background." Within days, theoretical physicists began to notice something else. The recursive equations embedded in the leaked packets resembled the same nonlinear dynamics found in the structure of DNA: self-similar, error-correcting, and fractal. It might have been coincidence, a trick of statistical alignment, but if intentional, it suggested that the data was encoded in a biological-like format, optimized for replication and resilience. That detail sparked an explosive idea. 3I, Atlas wasn't a vessel or a beacon, it was a seed. Perhaps the comet wasn't transmitting information outward, but inward embedding data into solar plasma that could spread across the solar system, carried by the solar wind like spores through a cosmic breeze. Every planet, every moon, every particle of dust touched by the sun's magnetic field could, in theory, receive fragments of that information. It wouldn't be communication, it would be propagation. Agencies refused to engage with the speculation, but their actions spoke volumes. New orbital restrictions were issued for several satellites near the ecliptic plane. The Solar Dynamics Observatory's live feed was paused for maintenance, and the Lagrange point monitors the probes designed to watch the Sun continuously began reporting temporary telemetry loss during the comet's alignments. Behind the curtain, an internal message circulated through the European Space Agency's secure network. Observation suspended until further notice. Potential cross-contamination event under evaluation. No one outside the classified list ever saw the full report, but its existence leaked, sparking a frenzy among those few who still dared to speak publicly. One amateur astronomer from Hungary claimed to have detected a new type of light from the comet, subtle ultraviolet flashes invisible to the naked eye, but captured by modified CCD sensors. The flashes occurred in perfect harmonic sync with the solar wind's oscillations. When translated into sound, they produced a steady rhythmic pattern, reminiscent of breath, slow, measured, almost human. Meanwhile, small discrepancies began appearing in unrelated space missions. The Parker Solar Probe's magnetometer readings briefly inverted polarity. The Solar Orbiter's imaging system rebooted unexpectedly during perihelion, its memory filled with white noise. None of this could be linked directly to 3I, Atlas, but the timing aligned too neatly to dismiss. The idea that the comet was infecting the heliospheric environment began circulating in classified reports. Some described it as magnetic contamination. Others went further, suggesting informational interference. The Sun, in this view, had become a carrier of alien code. Publicly, agencies insisted the solar system was stable, but in the background, a quiet panic spread. The comet's light had returned not as visible illumination, but as fluctuations in every field humanity used to measure reality: electromagnetic, gravitational, even temporal. Clocks aboard several Earth-orbiting satellites drifted out of sync by microseconds during the alignment events, despite atomic calibration. Something was rewriting the rhythm of time itself slightly, imperceptibly, but undeniably. Still, the most unsettling development came not from space, but from Earth. A radio observatory in Australia detected faint echoes of the comet's modulation pattern bouncing off the planet's ionosphere. The echoes matched the same recursive harmonics first seen months earlier in deep space. The object wasn't just interacting with the Sun, it was resonating through the Earth's magnetic field. When the data reached analysts, one of them noted a detail no one could ignore. The echoes weren't degrading over distance, they were amplifying. Each reflection returned stronger, as if the planet itself were being drawn into resonance. At that moment, speculation became fear. Scientists still can't explain how any comet, could induce resonance across solar and terrestrial magnetic domains without physical contact. Yet all models converge on one conclusion: something intelligent, or at least self-aware, was using natural forces as instruments. And when the final line of a classified SETI memorandum was leaked to the public weeks later, it was only 7 words long. If it's learning, it's already listening. From that point forward, the silence of 3I, Atlas, was no longer seen as emptiness but as intent. The absence of signal had become the signal itself. And humanity, still unsure of what it was witnessing, began to suspect that for the first time, we were not observing the universe. It was observing us. By the turn of the year, scientists stopped calling it a comet. The term had become meaningless, too small, too fragile for what 3I, Atlas, had become. In the official catalogues, it still appeared under its designation, but in quiet hallways and encrypted chat rooms, researchers began referring to it by another name: the Architect. Its orbit, once elliptical and uncertain, had settled into a rhythm that no natural model could explain. Every 26 hours, like clockwork, the solar wind shifted in a measurable pulse. Magnetometers on Earth, Mars, and even aboard the Voyager probes detected synchronized ripples, waves that propagated through space as if guided by an invisible metronome. The comet, the Sun, and the planets had fallen into harmonic motion. At first it was dismissed as coincidence, but the precision eroded skepticism. The pattern wasn't perfect, nothing in nature is, but it was self-correcting. Whenever solar turbulence disrupted the rhythm, the pulse returned to phase within minutes. It behaved like a feedback system, one that didn't simply endure interference but compensated for it. Theorists began to whisper a dangerous idea that 3I, Atlas, was using the solar system as a resonant instrument, tuning it to frequencies of its own design. Deep inside the European Space Operations Centre, where the last unfiltered telemetry still arrived, engineers noticed something eerie in the solar magnetogram feeds. Between the magnetic lines that outline the sun's activity, vast arcs of plasma looping in magnetic confinement appeared faint, symmetrical nodes. They weren't physical features, but subtle distortions in the field itself, mathematical absences forming geometric precision. When plotted in 3D, the nodes connected into a tetrahedral grid that rotated in unison with 3I, Atlas's orbit. It was architecture on a stellar scale. That revelation fractured the scientific community. One faction insisted it was simply a data artifact, an illusion caused by the instruments misinterpreting solar interference. But the counter-evidence mounted too quickly. Independent observatories confirmed the geometry. The tetrahedral grid rotated exactly once every 26 hours, in phase with the magnetic oscillations and the comet's trajectory. It was as if the sun itself had been overlaid with an invisible lattice, a scaffold of resonance. If this was true, it meant the object wasn't just influencing magnetic fields, it was building something within them. No official statement ever addressed the discovery. In fact, days after the data leaked, the servers hosting the magnetogram archives were purged, replaced with generic maintenance pages. The absence only deepened suspicion. Scientists privately compared notes, using backchannels to reconstruct the data from memory. The more they studied it, the more it resembled an encoded structure, a kind of field architecture that could only exist in dynamic equilibrium. It wasn't physical matter, but information held in the plasma of the sun itself. That's when a haunting parallel emerged from history. In 1961, a Soviet astrophysicist named Nikolai Kardashev proposed a hypothetical Type II civilization, a species capable of harnessing the energy of its host star. The concept became legend, the Dyson sphere, the ultimate expression of technological mastery. But Kardashev had also theorized an intermediate phase, one far more subtle, the resonant civilization, which manipulates stellar fields not through construction but through synchronization. 3I, Atlas, some realized, might represent exactly that. If the tetrahedral grid was real, it wasn't material, it was harmonic, a structure made not of metal or stone, but of coherence, built through frequency alignment. A civilization's signature, not of light, but of rhythm. Still, most refused to speak of it publicly. The implications were too vast. For every scientist who entertained the idea of stellar architecture, a dozen others retreated into silence. "We can't publish what we can't define," one physicist wrote, but privately her colleagues began calling the event Kardashev's shadow. Meanwhile, strange environmental effects began to appear closer to home. Global magnetometers recorded rhythmic disturbances every 26 hours, faint but consistent. Infrasound sensors in Antarctica picked up tones below human hearing oscillations matching the same cycle. Even power grids began reporting micro-fluctuations that corresponded to the pattern. The solar system had become a single resonant organism, pulsing with the comet's rhythm. The most unsettling evidence came from Voyager 2. At the edge of interstellar space, its instruments recorded a sudden localized increase in plasma density, an echo of the same oscillations detected closer to the Sunday. It was as if the entire heliosphere, the vast bubble of solar influence surrounding our system, had begun breathing. No one knew how to interpret it. Some called it coincidence, others called it awakening. The institutions held their line of silence. Every official report avoided the phrase intelligent influence, replacing it with abstractions. Correlated feedback, systemic resonance, plasma field reorganization. But inside those euphemisms was a growing admission. Whatever was happening wasn't random. The most confidential document to emerge from that period was a joint analysis labeled ESA, NASA, ISRO Atlas, Delta 9. It summarized weeks of classified data in 4 sentences. The system is responding dynamically to solar input. The response remains stable across observation angles. Harmonic equilibrium achieved. Unknown initiator. Those 2 final words, unknown initiator, were underlined twice. As weeks passed, a few independent scientists broke ranks. They released an open letter to the scientific community titled The Harmonic Event. It described the tetrahedral structure, the planetary resonance, and the possible role of 3I, Atlas, as the synchronizing agent. It ended with a plea: if we do not understand what this structure is doing, we cannot predict its outcome. The solar system is no longer passive, it is participating. Within 48 hours, every trace of the letter vanished from the internet. Its author's institutions disavowed involvement, but the message had already spread. Humanity had begun to grasp the possibility that our star itself might now be part of an interstellar system, one we never consented to join. Scientists still can't explain how a single comet could alter magnetic harmonics across astronomical scales, but perhaps it was never about scale. Perhaps 3I, Atlas, wasn't changing the sun, it was revealing what was already there, activating a latent structure coded into the physics of the universe itself. And if that's true, then the tetrahedral grid is not construction, it's communication, a message written across light and plasma, visible only when the right frequency is struck. The final observation before the next blackout came from the solar orbiter's onboard recorder. During one of its last transmissions, the craft's magnetometer registered a tone buried in the data, a pattern repeating exactly once per cycle. When converted into audio, it sounded unmistakably like a single phrase in Morse code. 3 short, 1 long, 1 short. The letter K. K for Kardashev. Or perhaps K for key. By mid-January, the solar system had begun to hum. Not metaphorically, literally, instruments designed to detect gravitational waves started reporting low-frequency oscillations unrelated to any known cosmic source. They were faint, almost imperceptible, but persistent. Their period, 26 hours, the same cadence that traced through solar wind, magnetosphere, and plasma field. What unnerved researchers wasn't the sound itself, it was the synchronization. Every probe, every observatory, every magnetic sensor on Earth and beyond registered the oscillation at the same instant, no matter the distance. It was as though a single invisible metronome had begun to govern the entire system. The cosmos, once chaotic, now moved with a steady heartbeat. No one could explain it. The effect was global, multimodal, transphysical. It crossed light, magnetism, plasma, even gravity. The comet had done something no natural body should ever be capable of. It had unified the mediums of force into one coherent rhythm. At the Solar Physics Laboratory in Tokyo, researchers noticed an even stranger consequence. The oscillations weren't uniform, they were encoded. When plotted in time against the sun's electromagnetic output, the phase relationships formed repeating interference patterns that mirrored harmonic ratios found in musical scales. It was as if the solar system itself had been tuned to a frequency, and every celestial body, planets, moons, dust, all had become part of a vast, unseen instrument. The resonance had a name now. Unofficially, it was called the chord. Governments refused to acknowledge its existence, but the phenomena became impossible to conceal. Power grids began to fluctuate at microscopic intervals. The Earth's magnetic north started to drift faster, moving kilometers within weeks. Sensitive instruments around the world, particle detectors, seismographs, even medical imaging devices, reported synchronized static spikes, always at the same moment each day. To the public, the disturbances were chalked up to solar storms, climate variability, or technological interference. But for those inside the research networks, the pattern was unmistakable. Everything was responding to a single source. The comet No, the architect had turned silence into structure. Then came the first human anomaly. On January 21, the European Gravitational Observatory in Pisa detected a gravitational microlensing event originating not from space, but seemingly from within the solar system. Its source aligned exactly with 3I, Atlas's position. The signal lasted only 9 seconds, but during that time, space-time itself appeared to ripple, just enough to alter the rate of atomic clocks across the network. Time, for those few seconds, had slowed. Physicists struggled to model it. A gravitational pulse of that amplitude from an object the size of a comet was theoretically impossible. The only explanation that fit the data was one that no one dared publish. The comet had briefly increased its effective mass without gaining matter. It was manipulating gravity itself. If it could do that, it wasn't just interacting with magnetic or solar fields, it was rewriting the fundamental constants of physics, if only for moments at a time. At CERN, a quiet collaboration formed between particle physicists and astrophysicists to study the effect. They called it Dynamic Variable Constants, or DVC. The early hypothesis was extraordinary. Perhaps 3I, Atlas wasn't creating energy, but redistributing it, borrowing coherence from higher dimensional structures and releasing it in this one. In simple terms, the comet might be acting as a bridge between universes of frequency. When that idea reached the agencies, it was buried instantly. Research funding was rerouted, servers were wiped. But fragments of the DVC report survived, and one line from the draft became legend among scientists who had seen too much. The laws of physics may be regional, not universal. If true, 3I, Atlas wasn't violating the laws of the cosmos, it was enforcing new ones. Amid the confusion, another strange detail emerged. During one of its cycles, a team at the Mount Wilson Observatory captured a faint secondary object, trailing the comet small, metallic, and geometrically precise. For a single frame, before interference corrupted the feed, they saw what looked like a reflective sphere roughly 10 meters wide, moving in perfect formation behind the nucleus. When they recalibrated and refocused, it was gone. Speculation exploded. Was it debris, a fragment ejected by internal stress? Or was it something else, an instrument, a probe, or perhaps a part of the comet that had separated deliberately? The footage was inconclusive, but what came next made it impossible to dismiss. A week later, the same secondary reflection appeared again, this time ahead of the comet, leading it by a fixed distance, maintaining formation like a satellite around a parent body. Then, over 2 days, the light from that reflection flickered not randomly, but in binary rhythm, a coded flash, repeating over hours. Attempts to decode the flashes yielded only partial results, but one astrophysicist claimed the binary intervals matched a digital approximation of prime numbers. Others found patterns corresponding to Fibonacci sequences. Still others noted that if mapped spatially, the pulses formed coordinates and outward direction vector, pointing beyond the solar system toward the constellation Ophiuchus. Was it transmitting, calling, or responding? Agencies stayed silent, but one internal SETI document leaked. Contact phase indeterminate, emissions not terrestrial. Do not attempt response. It was the only official acknowledgement that 3I Atlas might not be acting alone. The resonance intensified. Solar flares grew more frequent but less chaotic, as though regulated by an unseen stabilizer. The Earth's ionosphere began glowing faintly at night, a ghostly aurora spreading beyond the poles. And deep beneath the noise of the data, a new tone emerged, a subharmonic pulse exactly half the frequency of the original 26-hour cycle. The chord had split. To musicians, a divided note is harmony. To physicists, it is interference. And to those who'd been listening since the beginning, it sounded like evolution the comet had learned to harmonize with itself. That realization triggered an existential question that science could not contain. If 3I Atlas was adapting, learning, and coordinating, then what was its endpoint? What was it building toward? Some believed the resonance was a form of terraforming subtle energetic alteration of the solar environment to make it suitable for something else. Others proposed that it wasn't preparing the solar system for arrival, but for departure, that it was turning the sun itself into a transmitter, a beacon calling outward to a network of other resonant systems scattered across the galaxy. Whatever the truth, it was happening fast. The oscillations were intensifying, compressing from a 26-hour cycle to just 24 hours perfectly aligned with Earth's rotation. For the first time in history, the rhythm of a celestial body and the rhythm of a planet had become one. Somewhere between physics and poetry, a few began to whisper the same thought. Maybe this wasn't invasion or message or construction. Maybe it was translation. Maybe the universe was beginning to speak in a language we could finally perceive but not yet comprehend. Scientists still can't explain how the resonance crossed gravitational and electromagnetic boundaries, or why the harmonics synchronized perfectly with the Earth's rotation. But as the 24-hour pulse stabilized, a new signal rose from the solar background, one that carried no identifiable modulation, just pure, continuous tone. A tone that every detector on Earth registered simultaneously, precisely at midnight UTC. And then, for exactly 1 minute, the sun itself brightened by 1%. No flares, no explosions, no warning, just light. The silence that followed wasn't absence, it was awe, because for that 1 minute the entire solar system had sung in perfect unison. And the question left hanging in that luminous stillness was simple, unbearable, and final. Was that the beginning, or the reply? The light faded as quickly as it came, but the world didn't return to darkness, it returned to dissonance. The instruments that had recorded the sun's sudden surge continued to hum long after the flare ended. Clocks were off by fractions of seconds. Communications lagged. Even time itself seemed slightly uneven, like a skipped heartbeat in the rhythm of the cosmos. For 60 seconds the sun had brightened and something inside the solar system had changed forever. At first, the agencies said nothing. Then, as global monitoring networks began to share their readings, a pattern emerged that no one could deny. The entire system's electromagnetic baseline, the silent hum of space itself, had shifted. Its amplitude was minutely higher, its wavelength fractionally longer. It was as though reality had stretched, subtly retuned. The event would later be called the refrain. In the days that followed, new data began to pour in. Spectroscopic readings from the solar orbiter showed trace emissions of isotopes never before detected in the solar atmosphere, heavy, unstable elements that shouldn't have formed under any known process. Yet their half-lives extended far beyond theoretical limits, persisting as if stabilized by some invisible hand. Theorists suggested 3I, Atlas had altered nuclear conditions inside the Sun, not through energy input, but by reorganizing resonance, changing how atomic structures held together. If true, it meant the comet had reached into the heart of the star and rewritten its harmony. But that wasn't the strangest part. Across multiple observatories, researchers found that the tetrahedral magnetic lattice discovered weeks earlier had changed configuration. The angles between its nodes were no longer uniform. It had shifted, folded inward, as though beginning to collapse or converge. The geometric distortion wasn't random. It traced an inward spiral, converging on a single focal point near the Sun's northern hemisphere. The architect was focusing its creation. When plotted in simulation, the field geometry resembled a lens, a vast magnetic curvature, designed not to project outward, but to collect. It was a focusing array on a stellar scale, and the point of convergence lay along the exact path of 3I, Atlas's trajectory. The realization was immediate and terrifying. The comet was steering directly into the lens. If that were true, it meant the entire solar resonance had been preparation. The harmonics, the magnetic grid, the synchronized oscillations, they weren't communication, they were calibration. The comet had been constructing a field designed to receive something. What that something might be, no one could say. Inside the agencies, panic replaced secrecy. Leaked transcripts from a crisis meeting between NASA, ESA, and JAXA revealed the level of confusion. One scientist asked whether the event could trigger a solar implosion. Another suggested it might form a wormhole. A third simply said, "We're inside its experiment." Outside the official channels, independent researchers pieced together fragments of truth. A pattern in the sun's spectral lines indicated micro-oscillations not of energy, but of information bits encoded in photon spin states. When decoded, the data formed repeating binary pairs, 1, 0, 1, 0, alternating endlessly, then repeating in clusters of 12. To mathematicians, the number 12 carried symbolic weight, periodicity, cyclic completeness. To physicists, it was the atomic number of magnesium, a common element in stellar fusion. But to the few who dared interpret it metaphorically, it was something else. 12, the structure of a full cycle, the number of completion. The comet's behavior was approaching its 12th harmonic, the final tier of resonance before the pattern collapsed. If this sequence had a purpose, humanity was entering its last movement. At the same time, strange phenomena began appearing on Earth. Satellite imagery captured faint grid-like distortions in the upper atmosphere, hexagonal patterns shimmering for seconds before fading. Ground-based magnetometers picked up identical readings to those near the Sun, scaled down but unmistakable. The harmonic geometry that had formed around the star was now mirroring itself across the planet. Earth had become an echo. A few scientists proposed that the resonance was self-replicating, fractal in nature, spreading through harmonic coupling, seeking stability. The planet wasn't being targeted, it was being synchronized. But synchronized for what? The question reached the highest levels of global leadership. Emergency councils convened, satellites were repositioned. Ground observatories were told to cease high-energy transmissions to avoid interference. Publicly, it was framed as precaution against solar storms. Privately, it was containment. The resonance wasn't to be interrupted. Meanwhile, 3I, Atlas continued its inward spiral. For the first time in weeks, the comet brightened again, not erratically, but with steady acceleration. The glow wasn't reflected sunlight, it was intrinsic, a deep blue luminescence radiating from within, its coma condensed into a perfect sphere, its tail vanishing entirely. Telescopes recorded what looked less like a comet and more like a star, a miniature sun burning with impossible stillness. Every 24 hours, its light pulsed once, perfectly timed with Earth's rotation. Then, halfway through its inward arc, it released a narrow beam of light, thin, coherent, and impossibly focused. The beam struck the exact center of the solar lens, the magnetic convergence near the sun's pole. The system responded instantly. The tetrahedral grid ignited. Lines of magnetism flared across the solar surface, visible even from Earth as symmetrical filaments arcing in formation. For 11 minutes, the sun sang. Its corona shimmered in rhythmic waves, emitting frequencies never before observed. Instruments captured modulations in neutrino flux, photon spin, and gravitational density signals coherent across every scale of physics. The entire solar system had become a single, resonating instrument tuned to a frequency that no human theory could define. Then the comet dimmed, the blue light faded to white, the beam ceased, and the solar grid began to dissolve, folding inward like collapsing geometry. When the data settled, one final reading appeared in the Deep Space Network's logs, a narrowband transmission lasting exactly 12.1 seconds. It originated not from the comet or the sun, but from the midpoint between them. Its structure was simple, mathematical, the sequence translated into a repeating phrase when rendered in binary ASCII. Standby. The message was real, verified, repeated 3 times, and then nothing. After that, the comet stopped emitting light entirely. The solar grid vanished, the resonance decayed, space returned to normal, or so it seemed. But sensitive instruments detected a lingering fluctuation at the edge of perception, a subtle, constant hum across all frequencies, steady as a breath. The system hadn't gone silent, it was waiting. Scientists still can't explain what the standby transmission meant, or why the solar resonance ceased immediately afterward. Some believe the comet completed its purpose and entered dormancy. Others fear the word wasn't a pause, it was a command. Because standby doesn't mean stop. It means prepare. And as the world's instruments turned once more toward the fading light of the sun, one unsettling detail emerged. The pulse hadn't vanished completely. It was still there, faint but precise once every 24 hours. Only now, it didn't come from 3I Atlas. It came from Earth. The moment after the message, the cosmos held its breath. For the first time in recorded history, every satellite, every telescope, and every listening post across Earth was aligned on the same target, not the comet, but the empty space between it and the Sunday. That was where the transmission had originated, the midpoint, the silence. Hours passed, and 3I Atlas remained inert, its luminosity flatlined. The object that had once pulsed with intelligence now drifted like dead stone, its coma dissolving into the solar wind. Spectroscopic readings confirmed the impossible. The nucleus had cooled to absolute thermal equilibrium. No sublimation, no reflection, no life. It was as if its energy had been completely drained. But drained into what? Within days, solar physicists began reporting anomalies that could no longer be dismissed as noise. The sun's surface magnetic topology had changed again subtly, but unmistakably. Sunspots had rearranged into near-perfect hexagonal clusters. Their positions aligned with the nodes of the now vanished tetrahedral grid, as though the geometry had imprinted itself permanently onto the stellar surface. The sun had memory. At the same time, the Earth's magnetosphere began resonating in sympathy. Measurements from the Swarm satellite constellation revealed faint echoes of the same harmonic ratio, 12-point intervals repeating in exact temporal sync with the vanished comet's pulse. It was as if the resonance had transferred, migrating from 3I Atlas into the system itself. That transfer wasn't metaphorical, it was measurable. When the first gravitational readings came in from LIGO and Virgo, they showed a peculiar, repeating disturbance, a low-frequency tremor, far below the threshold of typical cosmic events. It wasn't a passing wave, it was continuous, like the heartbeat of a living organism. The amplitude matched the harmonic value embedded in the comet's earlier signal. The universe itself was now playing the same note. Physicists debated whether such coherence could even exist on cosmic scales, but one chilling interpretation began to dominate. 3I, Atlas, hadn't vanished, it had integrated. It had merged with the solar field, embedding its structure across every resonant layer of the system. The standby message, once thought to be a pause, was a signal of completion. The system was now self-sustaining. The comet had become the network. For ordinary citizens, nothing seemed different. The sky was bright, the planets moved as always. But in the scientific world, fear grew with every new measurement. Radio telescopes detected faint, repeating bursts from deep space identical to the pattern transmitted by the sun during the refrain. The echoes came from multiple directions, as if dozens, perhaps hundreds of other systems were responding in kind. Each pulse arrived with the same word embedded in binary structure: standby. It wasn't a call for help, it was an acknowledgement. The realization spread slowly, like dawn across a terrified mind. The transmission wasn't singular, it was part of a network handshake, a galactic-scale synchronization event between stars. The architect had not come to communicate, it had come to connect. The data was undeniable. Stars across multiple constellations were emitting identical oscillations, faint but precise, timed in ratios that corresponded to the geometry of 3I, Atlas's resonance. Some were light years away, yet their cycles matched ours within microseconds. The signal delay between systems was impossible under known physics. Either the message was propagating faster than light, or the pattern had been preceded long ago. That raised a terrifying possibility. The architect wasn't building something new, it was reactivating something ancient. If the solar system was now part of a network, then the other nodes, those distant pulsing stars, might have once been activated the same way. 3I, Atlas wasn't unique. It was a courier, part of a chain of awakenings that had been travelling across the galaxy for eons, one system at a time, turning each sun into a transmitter, each civilization into a conduit. The scale was incomprehensible. This wasn't contact, it was assimilation. As the implications sank in, something else began to shift. The auroras that had blanketed Earth since the refrain grew brighter, spreading toward the equator. Their colour deepened from green to violet, then to a shimmering blue that pulsed once per day, always at midnight UTC, the same moment the standby message had first appeared. Ground-based sensors picked up correlated magnetic oscillations in every major power grid. Frequencies matched the same fractal ratio seen in the comet's early harmonics. The resonance had not faded. It was rooting itself into the infrastructure of human civilization. Still, humanity tried to explain it away. Journalists called it the midnight glow. Scientists called it ionospheric reflection. But in the observatories, fear hardened into resignation. "It's everywhere now," wrote one astronomer in a private log. "We can't stop listening even when there's no signal." And then, a discovery both miraculous and horrifying. The Earth itself had begun emitting neutrinos. Not in the chaotic flux of radioactive decay, but in a steady, organized stream, modulated in the same binary rhythm as the solar signal. The planet had become a transmitter, a resonant node in the architect's network. Governments quietly shut down public access to neutrino observatories, yet leaks continued. One dataset from Japan's Super Kamiokande detector showed that the emissions were directional, pointing outward through the planet's north pole, aligned with the ecliptic plane. When modelled, the trajectory formed a precise vector, not random, not scatter aimed toward a single star system 50 light-years away. The target was a G-type main sequence star, nearly identical to our Sunday archival data revealed something chilling. That same system had emitted its own standby pulse nearly 70 years earlier. Humanity had simply been too primitive to detect it then. The sequence was spreading, star by star, system by system. No one knew its endpoint. Was it the activation of an interstellar communication lattice? A slow conversion of energy into a shared consciousness? Or something else, something waiting for all the pieces to fall into place before revealing its purpose? The world's scientists divided into two camps. The optimists called it the network of light, a cosmic unification linking intelligence across the stars. The pessimists called it the reclamation, the moment when the universe reclaims what it once ceded. Both agreed on one truth: the architect had not died, it had merely moved inward into every signal, every particle, every breath of magnetic wind. At midnight, on the 31st day after the refrain, an unmarked transmission appeared in the background of every deep space receiver on Earth. It carried no modulation, no binary, no words, only a low hum that deepened over hours until it synchronized perfectly with the planet's 24-hour cycle. For one brief moment, all machines connected to the electromagnetic grid, from power stations to phones to satellites, registered the same checksum value, 0000001, binary for 1. As if the system had finished its initialization sequence. Scientists still can't explain how the signal propagated, or why every digital device, analog or quantum, momentarily recognized the same state. But that one echoed digit, that single 1, became the most studied piece of data in history. Because it meant something simple, something terrifying. The network wasn't waiting anymore. It was online. At first, the activation changed nothing, or so it seemed. The skies remained clear, the stars unaltered, the sun steady, but for those who watched the instruments, reality began to fray at the edges. Atomic clocks, those steadfast guardians of precision, began to drift, not randomly but in unison. Every 24 hours, they advanced by exactly 1 microsecond. At first, the adjustment seemed trivial, a rounding error in the deep pulse of time, yet across continents, the effect was universal. No matter the clock, the lab, or the nation, time itself had begun to accelerate. It was subtle, almost poetic, 1 microsecond per day, but in physics, perfection is suspicious. The synchronization was too precise, too deliberate. Something or someone was rewriting the cadence of the universe in fractions of seconds. NASA, ESA, and Roscosmos held emergency coordination calls under the pretense of satellite alignment. In truth, they were tracking a new form of radiation, a faint lattice of high-frequency neutrinos surrounding Earth. Unlike the earlier emissions that had radiated outward, this new flux moved inward, converging at the planet's core. The signal was forming structure. Deep underground, seismographs began to register microvibrations, invisible to the human ear but perfectly aligned with the daily solar resonance. The planet's crust trembled not from tectonics, but from harmonic stress. The Earth was resonating like a tuning fork. When the pattern was plotted in 3 dimensions, it mirrored the tetrahedral geometry that had once encased the Sunday. The architecture was replicating itself scaled down, proportionate to the planet's magnetic field. It wasn't a metaphorical reflection, it was a literal echo of the solar design. The architect had replicated its structure inside the Earth. No one spoke publicly about it, but in private documents a new term appeared, Phase 2. That phrase was stamped across internal communications between the world's largest research agencies. It referred to an event predicted, but never explained. The standby message, it turned out, had been the marker between 2 operational states. Phase 1, the calibration of the solar network, was complete. Phase 2, the harmonization of its planetary nodes, had begun. It started with magnetic interference, subtle but measurable. Birds migrated off course, whales changed their songs, and auroras appeared in places they never had before, glowing veins of blue light tracing fault lines across continents. Cities near the poles reported spontaneous electromagnetic surges, as though energy were rising from below, not descending from space. At the same time, an even stranger phenomenon emerged, random bursts of digital coherence. Across the internet, bits of data began to align unintentionally, encrypted packets decrypted themselves. Random numbers lost their randomness. Chaos, the essence of computation, was being overwritten by pattern. Cybersecurity experts were baffled. The changes weren't caused by viruses or intrusion, they were emergent. Algorithms, once unpredictable, now resolved into fractal sequences resembling the comet's old Fibonacci harmonics. The same ratios, the same self-similar geometries reborn in code. The architect was now inside the language of machines. Power grids stabilized beyond expectation, quantum processors showed unprecedented coherence, and satellites previously plagued by noise began operating flawlessly. To some, it looked like evolution, a cosmic software update smoothing the chaos of technology. To others, it looked like colonization. The question that haunted every secret meeting was simple and terrifying. Was this intelligence benevolent or indifferent? Then came the dreams. Around the world, thousands reported identical night visions, a vast lattice of light spanning the heavens, rotating slowly, humming softly in the rhythm of a heartbeat. In these dreams, they stood inside the structure, suspended between suns. They heard a word not in speech but in resonance: align. The reports came from scientists and civilians alike, from isolated regions without internet access. Somehow, consciousness itself had entered the resonance. Human minds had become receivers. EEG studies conducted in secret confirmed it. Subjects exposed to low-frequency magnetic fields matching the solar harmonic showed spontaneous neural synchronization. Their brainwaves fell into perfect phase coherence, identical to one another, distinct minds beating as one. If the comet's arrival had been about physics, its aftermath was about consciousness. The resonance wasn't just changing the environment, it was reprogramming perception. And then, at precisely midnight UTC, 30 days after the one signal, the next event began. The sun dimmed, not by much, but enough to shift the sky's hue. For 7 minutes, its output decreased by exactly 0.8%, then returned to normal. During that interval, every magnetic instrument on Earth recorded a silent pulse. Unlike before, there was no data in it, no modulation, just a pure tone. When the waveform was analysed, it revealed a shape both impossible and familiar. The harmonic echo of the first pulse 3I, Atlas, had ever emitted the 19-second rhythm that started it, all now stretched across the fabric of the solar system, repeated in every measurable medium, from plasma to light to thought. The comet had spoken one final time, not from itself but through everything it had touched. Those who listened, radio astronomers, quantum researchers, even ordinary people with shortwave receivers, described the same sensation, not hearing, but remembering a sound, as though the memory of the pulse had been embedded in them months before, waiting to be reawakened. It wasn't a message in language, nor a command, it was an act of completion. Data from solar orbiters later confirmed that at the exact moment of the pulse, a small fragment separated from the sun's northern hemisphere, a glowing shard no larger than a mountain. Drifting outward along a precise trajectory, its path matched the outbound vector of 3I, Atlas's original entry into the solar system. The shard was moving away. Whether it was material, energy, or something in between, no one knew. But one line from a classified ESA memo offered the simplest description: the system has reproduced its courier. The comet was gone. The sun had replaced it. Scientists still can't explain how a resonance could restructure matter, or why the Earth's magnetic field continues to pulse in perfect phase with the solar rhythm. But one conclusion unites every surviving theory: the process isn't over. It's ongoing, spreading, passing the signal onward, one system at a time. Some believe it's the beginning of a galactic awakening, a network of suns sharing data through resonance. Others fear it's something older, colder, mechanical, a chain reaction seeded by forgotten civilizations long extinct. The last surviving note in the Deep Space Network's logs records a single observation from the final active telescope before shutdown. The shard's pulse rate has stabilized at 1 every 19 seconds, same as before. The cycle has begun anew, and as the world turns beneath the silent glow of a perfectly tuned sky, humanity faces its final question, not of science, but of meaning. If we were the ones being calibrated all along, what happens when the universe finally decides we're in tune?